Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I am Ahmad Manschadi from the Institute of Agronomy at the BOKU University in Vienna. And in this webinar, I would like to present the SSM intercrop model, which we have developed to simulate competition, facilitation, and yield dynamics in legume-cereal intercrops. We have developed this model in collaboration with our colleagues at the Technical University in Vienna within the framework of the EU-funded LEGUMINOSE project. I will start with a short introduction into intercropping systems and then move to the description of the intercrop model, starting with our modeling objectives, and then move to the structure and scientific approaches that we have implemented in this model. Following the development, we also conducted an evaluation study to test the performance of the model against some experimental data sets. And finally, I will give a short demonstration of the intercrop model using the LEGUMINOSE web-based platform. So whenever we grow two or more crop species simultaneously in the same field, we can talk about intercropping. We can distinguish different types of intercropping systems from fully mixed systems with no or a limited distinct arrangement. As you can see here, an intercrop of spring barley with field pea, to more geometric configuration of the intercropping system in terms of row and strips. We then talk about row strip intercrops. As you can see here, we have 2 rows of maize intercropped with 2 rows of fava beans. The intercropping systems generally provide some benefits, and several studies in the past they have demonstrated these benefits. With intercropping, we can maintain crop yields with fewer external inputs, such as fertilizers, pesticides. Intercrops generally increase yield stability. That means they reduce the interannual, interseasonal yield variation. They can contribute to soil fertility and soil health. They also can reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. They can contribute to enhancing pollination activity and overall biodiversity of cropping systems. And ultimately, we can then produce more healthy and nutritious foods and animal feeds from these systems. Now, despite these benefits, the adoption rate of intercropping systems in the EU has been low. And there have been several studies and projects in the past to look at those barriers. And we can then see those barriers in each component of agri-food systems. That means we talk here from the agricultural production, so from field to fork. And these components include pre-production, so input supply, to production, that means field farm level, activities, handling and storage, processing, trade and marketing, and ultimately consumption. Now, I'm not going into barriers that have been identified in each of those components. I will focus mainly on the first two, so pre-production and production barriers. Here we can distinguish between several different barriers, from insufficient policy and public support in terms of incentive subsidies to absence of machineries for sowing and harvesting of intercrops. One of the key barriers is also the lack of knowledge and advisory systems, and the other barriers are more related to agronomic activities. For example, the choice of intercrop species and cultivars, sowing ratios, spatial arrangements, as I mentioned in the past, fully mixed to row strip intercropping. In-season crop management can be challenging in intercrops, and also post-harvest processing, such as drying, separating, and storing. Now, addressing those agronomic barriers would require extensive field experimentation. And we know that generally field experimentation is associated with high costs and significant time requirements. And the other problem is that we cannot easily extrapolate experimental results from one location to other sites and seasons. Now, to overcome some of those agronomic barriers, we can use crop modeling. With crop modeling, we can design and perform in silico or virtual experiments and use the simulation results to do scenario analysis in order to address, for example, what-if questions. What happens if I select these two crop species or cultivars, or if I go with this sowing date compared to the other one? These analysis can be easily done with adequate and fully tested models. The models can also contribute to facilitating informed decision making at farm level, but also decision making of other stakeholders. Now, let me start with a kind of generic structure of a crop model and the key processes that usually are simulated by crop models. Crop models simulate plant growth and development as a function of inputs. And those inputs are related to weather, so daily weather data, precipitation, temperature, solar radiation. The inputs, the models also require inputs of soil characteristics, texture, for example, soil organic carbon, nitrogen, water holding capacity. The models also need inputs about the genetic characteristics of the crop species and cultivars, the maturity type, for example, and finally the management practices such as sowing date, planting density, fertilization, irrigation. With those inputs, the models can then simulate the daily increase in plant dry mass, biomass. They can also simulate the phenological development of a crop. As we can see here, the key processes are phenological stages, development of the crop, light interception, biomass or dry mass production, and the partitioning of dry mass into different plant organs. The models generally can also simulate the increase in rooting depth or the root system growth. They also simulate the canopy development, senescence of different plant organs, and they also can account for dynamics of nitrogen and water in the soil. Now, in the past few decades, we have seen the development and application of different cropping system models. I have listed here the major and well-known crop models such as CERES, DSAT, CropSys, STIX, APSIM, and SSM. We have used the SSM model, which stands for Simple Simulation Model, for the development of our intercrop model. This model has been developed for simulating monocrops, and the first version of this model was published in 1986 by Tom Sinclair, a soybean model, and since then the model has been improved and applied to nearly all grain crops. The model has been fully documented in a book, Modeling Physiology of Crop Development, Growth and Yield, written by Afshin Soltani and Thomas Sinclair. And as I mentioned before, the model has been applied similar to other cropping system models in applications ranging from climate change impact assessment to plant breeding and improving agronomic practices. We have used this model, the SSMI crop model, in the past few years in several different research projects. We have parameterized and evaluated this model in Central Europe for wheat, maize, potato, and legume species. And here you see photographs of showing my students collecting plant and soil data. Here you can see an aerial photograph of one of our experiments showing different blocks of winter wheat with different shades of green, and the lightest green here is where we had no nitrogen fertilization, so plant grown under nitrogen stress. And these photographs show the wheat seedlings either under nitrogen deficient conditions or under adequate nitrogen supply. So the intercrop model is then based on the iCrop model for monocrops. How do we simulate an intercrop system? When we start the intercrop model, then the monocrop models of the two intercrop species are run then simultaneously while sharing a shared soil module. This is how the intercrop model works. In this model, intercrop model, we have also included algorithms to account for interspecific competition and facilitation for above and below ground resources like interception. So competition for light can be simulated by our intercrop model. The model can also account for competition for soil resources such as water and nitrogen, as well as the transfer of nitrogen from legumes to non-legumes. Here we can see the schematic representation of our intercrop model. When we start the model reads then the inputs related to management, crop, and soil. In case of irrigation and or nitrogen fertilization, the quantity and timing of those applications are forwarded to the soil module. The model then based on the inputs from management, sets up the intercrop design. For example, if the intercrop is in fully mixed design or row strip intercropping, and initializes the soil conditions, basically soil, water, and nitrogen at the start of the simulation. The model then reads the weather data, and again, in case of rainfall at any particular day, the amount of rainfall is transferred to the soil module. The model then starts to simulate the phenological development of the two intercrops at a daily basis. It also simulates the dry mass production as a function of different input parameters and variables such as leaf area development, radiation use efficiency, plant height, and the amount of water which is available for transpiration. In case of legume species, the model also accounts for biological nitrogen fixation. The amount of biomass which can be produced at a particular day is then distributed to different plant organs, and with the start of grain filling in the grains, and at the end of the season, the model outputs then the grain yield of the two intercrop species. The model also simulates the daily increase in root depth, and from the root system development, the model calculates the amount of water and nitrogen which is available to each intercrop species. The model can also account for drainage of water and nitrogen leaching. Plant height in the model is a function of cumulative biological day. I don't want to go into details of the equations that we have implemented for calculating plant height, but basically the model requires two input parameters, so the maximum height and the potential increase in plant height to do the daily calculation of plant height. With light interception, for light interception, the model categorizes the two intercrops as tall and short, and the canopy of the taller species is subdivided into the upper and lower parts, and the lower parts of the taller species is the same as that of the short species. So this is how the model categorizes the two intercrops. And then the competition for light is then simulated as a function of leaf area index, plant height, and an input parameter K-par, which is light extinction coefficient. We have implemented two different approaches, one for simulating light interception in mixed intercrops, first developed and published by Kittings and Carberry, and the other one, which is a more sophisticated approach for simulating light competition in row and strip intercrops, again published by BOKU. As you can see here, in this more sophisticated approach, we use then the strip width of short crop, tall crop, as well as the boundary width between the two strips. Light interception, or fraction, F-int is fraction of intercepted radiation. So light interception in the model determine daily potential dry matter production, and the daily potential dry matter production is used to calculate the crop water demand using vapor pressure deficit and transpiration efficiency coefficient. And the model also simulates the daily actual transpirable soil water in the root zone of the two intercrop species. If under non-limiting water conditions, then the actual dry matter production is equal to potential. If water is limited, then the potential dry matter production is reduced using some stress factors in the model. The innovative approach that we have implemented to account for competition for soil resources is simple yet robust one, using the root depth only. So we are not looking at root length density and other root system characteristics. We use only the rooting depth and calculate the so-called root proportionality factor, RPF, for each of the two intercrop species. And RPF is the ratio of species root depth to the aggregate or sum of the root depths within each soil layer. So every day the model calculates an RPF 1 and 2 for each soil layer, and those factors are then used to allocate water and nitrogen to the intercropped species. So therefore, water uptake in the model is driven by rooting depth and transpiration demand. At the end of each simulation day, the amount of residual water in each soil layer is then equally distributed among the two species. In this way, we simulate a horizontal movement of water toward the species with higher water demand or higher water uptake. As I mentioned before, in the soil watt or soil water module, the model then calculates the soil water balance in each soil layer based on the inputs of water from rain and irrigation and removal of water from the system by soil evaporation, runoff and drainage, as well as plant water uptake. Similarly, for nitrogen, the model also calculates the nitrogen balance in each layer. Inputs of nitrogen in the model could be from fertilization, mineralization of soil organic matter, and in case of legumes, biological nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen can be lost from the soil by volatilization, denitrification, or leaching below the rooting zone. The model also calculates daily the amount of nitrogen uptake by the intercrop species. Now, that was a brief description of the model. As I said before, we then started with evaluating the model against some experimental data sets. We have found one comprehensive data set which is publicly available, and in this data sets we can find the results of 37 field experiments conducted with different legume species and cereal species in different countries in Europe, from Denmark in the north to Italy in the south, and the experiments were conducted from 2001 to 2017. We have used the experimental data for two intercrop combinations. One is winter wheat faba bean, and as you can see here, we have found data from 3 field experiments in that data set with different cultivars of the two species. They were grown under different planting densities in sole crops as well as in intercrops, and crops were also differently fertilized in those experiments. We had also different intercropping types, from mixed intercrops to alternating rows. Similarly, we also extracted the data for spring barley field pea from that data set. You see here the experiments conducted in different countries with this more or less same variation in planting density, intercrop type, and fertilizer, irrigation, and sowing. We also used an additional data set which was collected for the intercrop of winter wheat with faba bean at 2 locations in Germany, in Göttingen and Hanover. This dataset includes some details of initial soil conditions like mineral nitrogen, water, and also provides time series of phenology, which was and biomass production, which was important for parameterization and evaluation of our model. I'm just showing a few slides from that evaluation study. Because we are using the monocrop versions of for simulating an intercropping system, first we tested the performance of the crop models for monocrops. And what you can see here is the grain yield of winter wheat and faba bean under different nitrogen fertilization. As I said, from monocrops. The curves here show the simulated yields, and the dots here, the points, are the observed. And as you can see here, our monocrop models were able to respond to variation in nitrogen fertilization. We similarly tested the response of our monocrop models to, for example, planting density. And as you can see here, in case of winter wheat, when we varied the density from 150 to 300 plants per square meter, as you can see here in both cases, so in simulated and observed data, they do not show much difference, because generally we know that cereals compensate for lower densities by producing more tillers. The faba bean, as you can see here, responded to variation in density from 15 plants to 30 plants per square meter. So this figure shows the simulated versus observed yields of winter wheat and faba bean. Across all those different experiments, you can see here we had large variation in yields of those two crops, from less than 2 tons to more than 5 tons. With the exception of a few experiments, the model generally performed very well in simulating the yields of monocrops. Similarly, the simulated grain yields of the two species in intercrops matched also quite well the observed data. So it shows that the model is quite robust in capturing the interaction of crops in intercrops. If I move now to the other combination, spring barley field pea, you see the more or less the same results. So for monocrops, again simulated versus observed yields, we see a large variation in observed data, and again, with exception of a few experiments, the model was able to capture the variation in grain yield in monocrops and in intercrops. Again, the model performed quite well. I have to mention that for some experiments, we were not able to set up the model perfectly, because as I said, some experiments did not include, for example, the initial soil, water, and nitrogen conditions, and some other inputs which are required for running the model. So following that evaluation, we move now to a short demonstration of the intercrop model. We have created a short training manual, which is available on the website of our project. You can download this PDF file and run the exercises that have been included here. Here we provide really a step-by-step guidelines in how to set up and run the model. What I try to do now is to move to the Leguminose web-based platform and set up quickly the model for one field and run it. So if I go now to my browser and log into the system, you can get the information and instruction about how to log into the system from our website. Once you have started the Leguminose platform, you see then different tabs here. You see the actual weather data. The advantage of this platform is that we have integrated the weather data, which is required for running the model, as well as the soil data from the European soil map, so that you can then run the model for any location in the EU, because the weather data and soil data are available. The weather data in the system come from the German weather service. So in order to initiate the simulation, we need to select a field. You can find a global map here, and either you can select a particular location by providing the latitude, longitudes, or you can draw a polygon around any field and generate your field and give it a name. For example, my first field is the name of this field. Once you have selected a field, then you can go to the simulation tab, and in the simulation tab you can now set up the model to run a particular intercrop for that particular field. As you can see here, you can specify the sowing date for crop 1 and 2. You can also select the crop species for crop 1 and crop 2. As you can see here, we have included several crop species here, and for each crop species you can select the maturity type as early, medium, late, and also the plant height type as short, medium, and tall. In this particular exercise, we select an field P, late maturity cultivar with short height, and spring barley, again late maturity type with medium height. You can then decide whether you want to run the model for a stripped intercrop or a fully mixed. We just select the fully mixed. For that, you need to provide the sowing density or planting density for field pea and spring barley. And as I mentioned before, the default for weather data is the German weather service. If you have your own weather data from your own weather station, you can upload the data and use them here. You can specify the timing and quantity of irrigation for your simulation. Similarly, you can do it for fertilization. In this particular exercise, as you can see here, we applied an one rate of nitrogen fertilizer, so 30 kilogram per hectare to both crops. But this is user defined. You can specify fertilization strategy as you like. And once you have set up your simulation, you can click on Save and Execute simulation. So the model is then run, and you see then 6 graphs here showing the total dry matter, yield, grain protein, water uptake, cumulative nitrogen, and plant height. Now in this particular simulation, if I go back here and deactivate first this one, I will come back to that later on, and run the model again. So we run the model only for the intercrop of field pea with spring barley. As I said before, you see the 6 graphs here. The model can output more than 70 different variables, but for the sake of simplicity, we have included only 6 graphs here. If I click on the zoom button, we can then zoom in and see the simulated yield of field pea and barley here. And you can also see the, for example, simulated plant height. Now, if you want to compare the intercrop of the 2 species with their respective monocrops, you can activate this switch here, and you specify then the densities, sowing densities for the monocrops of the 2 species. And if you want to simulate again fertilization irrigation, you can specify the strategies here. If I click now on Save and Execute, now the model actually simulates both the monocrops and intercrop of the 2 species. Again, if I click on yield, for example, we see the yield of field pea, yield of spring barley in intercrops, and the yields of the 2 crop species when they were grown as monocrops. So it's very then easy to compare the yields of crops in intercrops and monocrops. So this was a short demonstration. As I mentioned before, please go and download the training manual and do additional exercises. To draw some conclusions from this modeling study, what I've presented, the system intercrop model is a daily single season process-based model for simulating intercropping system. I have shown that the model performed quite good against experimental data sets, but we need additional data that also include time series of crop development and growth and water nitrogen content to test the model. We need also to parameterize the model for other crop species and crop combinations. One thing that I wanted to mention here is that in our intercrop model, we do not change any parameters when we run down any parameters of the monocrop models when we run them in intercrop. That's the advantage of our model. We are in the process of conducting a global sensitivity analysis to identify which model inputs matter most and how much. So to quantify the sensitivity of our model to input parameters such as plant height, for example, or sowing density. With that, we hope to be able to provide more reliable simulations for decision making for farmers and also advisory systems. As I have demonstrated, because the model has been integrated into the Leguminose web-based platform, the user can log in and run the model from any location. You do not need to download the model and install it on your own computer. So that was the end. Thank you very much for your attention.